whoa, 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 whoa. That was Ikvisa by Zusha. Ikvisa based on Akev, the heel. This idea that we're in the heel of history. We're in a tough time, but the Messianic age is about to arrive. We're just about there. It's around the corner. It's a very hopeful song, even in the midst of this heaviness. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? A good Shabbos. Shabbos begins tonight. And Chag Sameach. Well, let me turn that off. Chag Sameach. Sukkot begins tonight. Sukkot, which is also known as the season, the festival of our rejoicing. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on this fine Friday? And man, we got a lot of good stuff we're going to be doing today. We're starting a new chapter. And right at the beginning, we're going to have a whole bunch of digressions into wisdom. This is going to be a lot of fun today. Who's going to enjoy it with us? Pauline from Arkansas, Melissa from Great Neck, Titilitop says Coop. I'm not sure what that means. Joy from New Jersey, Adrian from Columbia Falls, Lucy from Minneapolis, Carol from Cleveland, Stephanie from Herndon, Virginia. Dana says Shalom. Paul with us from Louisiana/Florida. Yehudit from Florence, South Carolina says Hag Sukkot Sameach and Shabbat Shalom. Hibbler Elaine is with us from Petoskey, Michigan. I guess it's Elaine Hibbler. James from Indianapolis. Guy from Ohio. Tom says good Shabbos from Philly. Luciana is with us from Michigan. And Kim with us from Fontana, California. Over on the YouTube side, I had not refreshed. And hopefully somebody's with us over here as well. All right. What have we got today? This is the beginning of our discussion of Chapter 5 in Tractate Eruvin. We're in the third volume of the Talmud. This is Daf Nun Gimel, page 53. This chapter focuses, the whole tractate is about the Eruv. In this case, we've been talking about the Shabbos boundary, how far a person can walk on Shabbos. And we've said over and over again that boundary, if you live in a city, instead of beginning at your actual dwelling, at your home, as if you were in the countryside, if you live in a city, it's like the whole city is considered to be your Shabbos dwelling. It's like your place, your 4 cubits, where you are standing, gets expanded to include the entire city that you are in. So then the question is, okay, well, what is the whole city? What do we consider the actual boundary of the city? So let me read that Mishna to you. And then as soon as we get into the discussion of the Mishnah, the sages are going to disagree about the language that's used in the Mishnah, and that's going to be our hinge to go on a wild and wonderful wisdom journey. Okay, the Mishnah itself says, how does one extend me'abrin? The Hebrew is me'abrin. How does one extend the boundaries of cities in order to ensure that all its protrusions are included within the boundaries of the city? As we have seen before in our journey, a city, for the purposes of the Shabbos limit, the city is going to be considered a square, going to be based on the dimensions of a city and the type of city and the sort of ideal city as laid out in the Torah when speaking about the cities of refuge and specifically the cities of the Levites, right? And it's said that the cities of the Levites would be 2,000 cubits along the north, south, east, and west sides. So the sages see that as a square, more or less a square, but definitely with a straight edge. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, the edge of the city is going to be a straight edge, and we know that towns and cities, don't really look like squares with a perfectly, straight edge on the side of the city. So where are we going to locate that edge? That's what we're talking about right now. And the Mishnah explains, he extends a straight line across the edge of the city. And if a house is recessed and another house protrudes, or a turret is recessed and another turret protrudes from that line. And similarly, if there were remnants of walls 10 handbreadths high and bridges and monuments over graves in which there is a residence, one extends the measure of that side of the city as though there were other structures opposite them in the adjacent corner of the city. And prior to measuring the Shabbos limit, one renders the city like a square tablet so that it gains the corners, although there are actually no houses in those corners. So we have some lovely illustrations here. Okay, hopefully the glare is not going to be too annoying. Let's see if I can get that right. Okay, so here we see this would be the ideal situation, and the city is pretty much laid out like a square, and so it's pretty obvious where the edge of the city is. Anyone who lives in that city, he can walk anywhere around the city on Shabbos, and then if he wants to leave the city, he can walk another 2,000 cubits. But what if a city is not so perfectly laid out? So for example, it's a walled city, and it has turrets like this for the city's defense, and some of those turrets stick out. So if it sticks out like that, you're going to move the whole city limit, the edge of the city, outward to include the turret. And if you have a situation, which is so normal, right, especially in these kinds of old towns, where, it's not a walled city, it's not turrets, but there's just houses out there, and somebody built his house a little further out, maybe to get a little bit more of a backyard. So he's further out from the city. Now you're going to extend the whole city limit to include that guy. Right? And then if somebody's even further out, you're going to extend the whole city limit. This could go on forever, but there is a limitation, as we've seen before, that if the house is more than 70 cubits away from the city, then it's just considered disconnected from the city and we don't extend the city limit. But as long as these houses are within 70 cubits of what is normally considered the city limit, then we extend the city limit to include those houses. And then they were talking about a house that happens to be by a graveyard, and so that's represented here. And so as long as that house that's near the graveyard, it's a residence, right? We're only going to do this for residences, but it is a residence. It's within 70 cubits of what was the city limit. So now we're going to extend the city limit even more. That is the concept that's being discussed here. That's the basic idea of our Mishnah, the first Mishnah here of chapter 5. But here we go. So let me get my notes here in front of me. So the first thing that the Gemara is going to pick up on is this word me'abrin. And me'abrin means to extend, right? So it's a verb. That mem beginning signals you that it's a verb. It's very interesting, like when you hear, really experienced teachers of Hebrew concepts who are speaking in English, the syntax is often so weird. Like when you say a verb, you don't say we extend, we say we are extension. We are an extension of, right? We are extended. And Hebrew is just a little bit that way. I don't do that so much. I mean, I didn't grow up in the yeshiva system, and I'm not such an experienced teacher, and my Hebrew is really not as strong as I could wish it to be. But here we're going to do just a little bit with Hebrew. And we look here. So here's this word, me'abrin, that I've written out. And as you can see, I've written it twice. And if you don't read Hebrew, just don't worry about it. But the word is written twice. And the first version is mem alef bet resh nun, me'abrin. And the second version is mem alef bet resh nun. And it's the same word. It sounds the same because alef and ayin are both letters that don't really have a sound of their own. They're sort of like vowels, but in Hebrew, the letters aren't vowels. The vowels go underneath, right? The vowels, basically all the letters in the Hebrew alphabet are consonants, and then you put the vowel sounds as sort of punctuation marks under the consonants, and that's how you know to sound out words with the correct vowels. With the exception of ayin and alef. These letters are just waiting for a vowel, but they don't have their own sound. Now, in some versions of Hebrew with certain accents, the ayin will have a little bit of a sound of itself, a little bit of a guttural sound, but a little bit similar to Arabic. But basically, the aleph and the ayin are sort of silent letters just waiting for their vowel. So if you spell it with aleph or ayin, it doesn't really change the way you're going to pronounce the word. It may be a different word, but it won't change how you pronounce it. So the Gemara points out that they're not sure which way this word me'abrin, to extend, ought to be spelled, with the ayin or with the aleph. And then it says, and why would it be one way or the other? Because with the aleph, the lower version, so then that is reminiscent of ever. We're talking about that we're extending the city, and ever is a limb, like an arm or a leg. And we're saying that if the city has an arm or a leg, and ever, we're going to extend the city limit to include that limb of the city. The other way to look at it is with the ayin, and there we have an ubra, which is a pregnant woman, and it's like the city's pregnant, right? Like the city has grown a belly, and we're going to extend the city limit to accommodate the belly that's sort of, extended out from the city like a pregnant woman. So which is it? Is it going to be that we're going to spell it with an ayin and it's going to remind us of a pregnant woman, or are we going to spell it with an aleph and it's going to remind us that the city is growing an extra arm or an extra leg? It's a grammar question, a spelling question. And now that it's been asked, the Gemara is not going to answer. So that's the question. It's been asked. Are we going to spell it with an aleph and be reminiscent of a limb? Or are we going to spell it with an ayin, be reminiscent of a pregnant woman? And the question is left hanging. But having asked a question of sort of Torah knowledge that is being determined by word choice and wording, and how a Torah lesson can extend from the word choices that we use, the Gemara is now going to digress into several teachings and even stories that are based on people using language properly or improperly, precisely or lazily. Now, I'll just mention that when I was in law school, right? So I went to a good college, then I went to law school, then I went to film school. And I remember that even though in college I was an English major, and so I read and wrote quite a bit, but it wasn't until I was in law school that I felt like, oh, people are really sloppy in the way that they use language. It happens all the time. And when you start, lawyers have to be very precise with language, because when they write contracts, they're obligating people in a series of obligations and relationships that have to be very specifically defined, because it means money, it means actions, it means lawsuits. If you're not precise about what you're agreeing to, well, then you really haven't agreed on anything. And so that's part of a lawyer's training. And I remember during first year of law school, I suddenly felt like I heard the English language for the first time, even though I'd been an English major in college. And what specifically I was hearing was how often people are at each other's throats in disagreement, where if you would listen closely to what they're saying, like there's really very little between them. Like they disagree on very little, and they don't realize how close to each other they are because they're being sloppy with language. Or sometimes people would just think they're on the same team and that everything is fine and they've agreed on everything, no problem. But if you would listen closely to what they think they're agreeing on, you'd realize, well, actually, these people are very far apart, and they don't know it because their use of language is sloppy. So that's kind of what the sages are going to be talking about here through a series of examples. The first one is the Cave of Machpela. Nina and I and the kids were very blessed. I'm so glad we went last year in the summer of 2019, when it was possible, because if we planned to go in 2020, it might not have been. But we took a trip to Israel, and we saw many amazing things. We've all been to Israel before, but that was our first time going as a family together. And one of the things that we did is we went to Hebron and to the Cave of Machpela, the place where the matriarchs and patriarchs are buried. This is the Cave of Machpela that Abraham, our father Abraham, bought from from Ephron the Hittite, right, in the field of Mamre, I believe it was called, as a burial place for his wife Sarah, right? Now, the word Machpela means double. So the question is, why is it called a double cave? A double cave. And so you like my new board here? Actually, I'm going to come back to that just a second. I got a couple of these boards now. So the question is, why is Machpela called a double cave? And one reason is that it kind of looks like this, or is it that it looks like this? Okay, so this is two versions of it. One is it's like a cave with two rooms where you're just entering the outer cave and then there's an inner cave, so it's two rooms. Or the other idea is that it's a cave and you enter into the top floor and then there's a deeper cave down below. And so the Gemara asks, well, if it's just two rooms, like an outer room and an inner room, does it need to be labeled? Does it need to be called the double cave just because it has two rooms? I mean, after all, most people's houses have at least two rooms. It's not that special. It must be that the cave has an upper cave and a lower cave, and that seems more interesting and a reason to call it the double cave. However, the Gemara says, no. It's not because of the arrangement of the rooms inside the cave. Now, by the way, when you go to visit the Machpela in Hebron, it's incredibly moving, right? You don't enter that cave where the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried. That's way below this sort of, prayer space and visitor center that is far above the matriarchs and patriarchs. But it's very special, and you're standing over that cave, and you're standing over the final resting place of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rebekah, of Jacob and Leah. Not Rachel. Rachel is buried elsewhere in the tomb of Rachel. So there's three couples that are buried there, and our tradition holds that there's actually one other couple who are also buried in the Cave of Machpela, and that is Adam and Eve, right? So there are four couples who are buried in the Cave of Machpela, and that's the reason that it's called the double cave. Not so much the arrangement of the rooms, but because of these four pairs of couples. Place is also called Kiryat Arba, so the four couples. And that's a reason to call it the double cave, teaches the Gemara. Another instance of language being used with some precision. We have this story after Joseph, is sold into slavery by his brothers, the sons of Jacob, that eventually Joseph ends up in prison in Egypt. Then he interprets some people's dreams, the cupbearer and the baker. He interprets them accurately. And then when Pharaoh has those dreams about the 7 lean years and the 7 fat years, or the 7 lean cows and the 7 fat cows, the 7 lean ears of grain that follow the 7 healthy ears of grain, and no one can interpret it for him, then this guy who was in prison with Joseph remembers Joseph and says, yeah, well, there was a guy who could interpret dreams. He's summoned. And, after one meeting, Joseph goes from a guy languishing in prison to the second most powerful man in the whole world, in charge of the whole project of gathering all the plenty, the food of plenty during the years of plenty, which will save Egypt and this whole region during the years of drought. And because of that, Egypt was very grateful to Joseph and his family. The Jews ended up coming into Egypt during that drought and settled there. And then over the next few generations, just reproduced astronomically fast. And some generations later, we had become millions, and then we were enslaved, right? And it's because Egypt said there's too many of these Jews here, and maybe they would join with one of our enemies and defeat us from within, so we're going to enslave them. And who is it that enslaved them? The Torah says, this would be in the book of Exodus, there arose a Pharaoh, a king, there arose a new king, a new king who knew not Joseph, a new king who did not know of Joseph. And so here the Gemara asks, well, it says a new king. Does that mean if he's a new king, it must be because, it's a later king who didn't know Joseph in his time. But some say, no, actually, it's the same king, just much later than those events. He changed his mind about the Jews, and that's why he issued that decree to enslave the Jews. And why would we even think that? It says there was a new king, but it doesn't say that the old king died. So since the old king didn't die, it must be that it's the same king, and it's not that he's really a new king, it's that he's like a new king, he's like someone who didn't know Joseph, and what is new about him is these decrees that he issues against the Jews. So sort of focusing on the word new. Then the Gemara gives a mnemonic, and we usually don't go into these because we're not trying to memorize the whole Talmud the way the sages of the Mishnaic and Talmudic eras, they would memorize all these teachings that we're learning day after day. And it's hard enough to keep them straight just for the hour that I'm teaching after I've learned them that morning. They would try to memorize all of that, an extraordinary amount of knowledge to put into a person's head. And one of the teaching aids, the learning aids that they had for memorizing so much Torah was mnemonic devices, here called a siman, which the word is a sign. It serves like a sign, and it serves as a mnemonic device. And the one that's given here is 18 and 12 we studied with regard to David, and he will understand, right? And so that's just a little, a bunch of words you kind of memorize, and it helps you open up to all the teachings which follow. So this 18 and 12, this has to do with the teaching of Rabbi Yochanan. And why is it being brought in here? Because it has to do with this question of me'abrin, is it spelled with an ayin or with an alef? So Rabbi Yochanan taught that in the beginning of his learning, the great Rabbi Yochanan taught that in the beginning of his career as a Talmudic scholar, he spent 18 days with a rabbi named Oshaya the Distinguished, Rabbi Oshaya the Distinguished. He spent 18 days learning from Rabbi Oshaya the Distinguished, and he only learned two things. The first thing is that me'abrin is spelled with an aleph, right? So it's spelled with an aleph, and it sort of reminds us, it's kind of a mnemonic device, that when we extend a city, it's like we're extending to surround as if the city has grown a new limb, a new arm, or a leg. But the second thing he learned is he learned the hearts of Rabbi Oshaya the Distinguished, his 12 students. So this is an extraordinary thing to say, right? So in terms of what he remembers specifically that he learned from Rabbi Oshaya in the very beginning of his learning, the only thing he remembers is that we spell me'abrin with an aleph. But what he really remembers from getting to know Rabbi Oshaya in his classroom is that Rabbi Oshaya the Distinguished had raised 12 students to become extraordinary people. And that is a testament to what a great teacher Rabbi Oshaya was. Because in that short time, in 18 days, Rabbi Yochanan was able to come to know the heart of each of those 12 students of Rabbi Oshaya. And here's something important about the word heart as it's used by the sages and in Torah and Talmudic literature. When they talk about someone's heart, they're not talking about the seat of their emotions. That's part of it. But when they talk about someone's heart, they're actually talking about the seat of wisdom in a person, right? For the sages, they didn't think of the brain as the center of a person's knowledge and wisdom. They thought of the heart that way, that the heart was this connection to other people, to the Lord, to the higher world, to these vast mansions of wisdom that can possibly be learned. And they enter a person through their heart. And that's why, for example, in Psalm 90, which is a psalm authored by Moses himself, one of the lines is, teach us to number our days so that we may attain a heart of wisdom. A heart of wisdom. This was the ultimate goal for the sages, to attain a heart filled with wisdom. And so you can see, what does it mean that if all that wisdom and knowledge and understanding ends up lodging in a person's heart as opposed to his brain? Okay, so maybe they didn't understand anatomy the same way that we do. But they had a good enough idea, that language and ideas would get processed in the gray matter between someone's ears. I mean, they saw people die. They understood much more than we would think they do. But when they say that knowledge, understanding, and particularly wisdom resides in a person's heart, in the organ that is pumping blood through the whole body and keeping the body alive, and that when the heart goes out, the person dies, to say that the seat of wisdom is in a heart is to say that wisdom that doesn't lead to wise action is not really wisdom, right? If you just got a bunch of facts in your head, what have you really learned? But if you've acquired wisdom, if you've acquired the understanding, knowledge, experience to start conducting yourself like a wise person, and you are putting all that learning into action with your limbs, as it were, then you can be called truly wise. And he could see that even in those 18 days, he could see that Rabbi Oshaya's students were being educated in that way, that what they would learn, they would incorporate into themselves and would pump through their bodies thanks to the heart of wisdom pumping the blood all around their bodies and animating their limbs. Rabbi Yochanan also said that the hearts of the early sages, right? He's still going with this metaphor, or maybe not a metaphor. I mean, it's the way they understood it is not metaphoric, right? They said that the wisdom sits in the heart of a person. And he says that the hearts of the early sages, in terms of their ability to take in wisdom, was vast compared to later sages. So he says that the early sages, their heart was like the opening to the entrance hall of the temple, of Solomon's temple when it stood. And so the entrance hall was 20 cubits wide by 40 cubits high. It was a vast, vast entranceway. And the later sages, that was like the opening to the sanctuary, right? It was an inner opening to the Holy of Holies, but a smaller opening. So the later sages were only able to grasp the greater wisdom available in the world, through a heart that was reduced in capacity, much smaller, 10 by 20 cubits instead of 20 by 40 cubits. And he says, and we, Rabbi Yochanan is speaking now, and he says, so the early sages had that huge doorway, 20 by 40 cubits. And the later sages, much smaller, 10 by 20 cubits. But our hearts are just like the eye of a needle in terms of our ability to really grasp the great wisdom, the divine wisdom in the world. Now, this is Rabbi Yochanan speaking, right? So Rabbi Yochanan is just one of the towering intellects, one of the towering sources of wisdom in the Talmud. And for him to say, yeah, I mean, my heart and my ability to grasp wisdom can be compared just to the eye of a needle, compared to the entranceway of the early sages, which was 20 cubits wide and 40 cubits high, 30 by 60 feet, as it were. And so who were these early sages that Rabbi Yochanan is referring to? He's saying that Rabbi Akiva represents those early sages, and Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua represents the later sages. Or some say Elazar ben Shemua represents the early sages, and Rabbi Oshaya the Distinguished represents the later sages. But in any case, says Rabbi Yochanan, we are just like the eye of the needle. And then Abaye, right, who's in Amora, so he's even later. Rabbi Yochanan at least was a Tana. He's in the Mishnaic period, much closer to those early sages. Abaye says, oh, well, you might be like the eye of a needle, but at least you were an opening that could bring wisdom into your heart. We over here in Bavel, our brains and our hearts and our ability to grasp wisdom is so clumsy that we're like pegs in a wall, right? We're not even an opening. We're just trying to, get a peg into a wall, and we can't even find the hole. We're just trying to stick it in somewhere and hope that something will stick with us. And Rava says, we're not even pegs in a wall. We're like somebody pushing finger into wax. We're just like pushing in like super klutzes, trying to grasp some wisdom, and we barge in like a finger pushing itself into soft wax. But when you pull the finger out, it comes out with nothing. It doesn't even bring the wax with it. And Rav Ashi says, oh no, it's even worse than that. It's like a finger in a pit. The finger goes into the pit. It doesn't even sense how big the expanse of wisdom is. And when it comes out with nothing at all, not even the trace of wax. And what he's saying is those early sages, first of all, they were closer in time to the revelation at Sinai. That's why the earlier generations are deemed to be wiser than the later generations. And second, somehow those people were just bigger brains. Bigger hearts. They had bigger hearts of wisdom. They were just able to learn and to retain more. And he says, and we just don't even have the capacity to learn or remember as much as they. We learn something and we lose it. And that's Rav Ashi talking, who in partnership with Ravina would be the editors of the Talmud, the ones who set down the Gemara. People we look to as, vast hearts of wisdom that we could never hope to emulate. And so obviously they're using hyperbole to try to bring home the point of the enormous respect that they have for their predecessors. Then the Gemara goes on to make a distinction, or Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, and then the Gemara is going to pick it up, and he's going to say that in the Holy Land, in Eretz Yisrael, there was a difference between the Judeans and the Galileans. Okay, so the people who lived in the area of Judea, the people studying Torah in the region of Judea, they would be much more precise and particular with the way that they used words. They were more careful with their speech. And the Galileans were somewhat sloppy. One word is as good as another. They would slur their speech, almost like the way that parents make fun of teenagers who mumble and aren't really clear what they're saying. So the Judeans, it's almost like they were more the city people, right? Jerusalem's in Judea, on the border between Judea and Benjamin. But they would say like they're the more, refined and worldly people in terms of their use of language. And the Galileans were just much more sloppy with the way that they used language. And also the Judeans, because they were more particular, their Torah endures. And the Galileans, because they were sloppy, their Torah does not endure. And the Gemara also says that the Judeans made use of mnemonics to help them remember those teachings, and the Galileans didn't trouble themselves to learn mnemonics, and so they forgot more of their teachings. And the Judeans would rely on one teacher, like they had a chief rabbi. So they said that somebody was setting the standards, and so everyone was learning the same stuff. Whereas the Galileans, they didn't take the trouble to have an authority, a central authority in terms of the curriculum of the schools, let's say. Everybody was learning and teaching their own thing. And so since there was so much disagreement around their academies, it's another reason that Torah didn't endure among the Galileans. And also, says Ravina, the Judeans would announce what tractate is being studied so that in all the different academies in that region, people would be studying the same text. And the Galileans, everybody was studying their own thing. So this idea that everyone's on the same page, which of course thousands of years later has become Daf Yomi, right? That we're all on the same page. It's an announced course of study. We're currently running one page behind. And since we're entering Sukkot tonight, and I'm not going to be back with you Saturday night because it'll still be Sukkot, so I won't be teaching again until Sunday. If we do a double class Sunday night, then we would be back to just 1 day behind. If not, we're going to be 2 days behind because we're currently running 1 day behind. And I suspect we won't do a double page when we come out because the page after this one also has this big list of real interesting wisdom teachings. But at some point we'll it'll be a place that makes sense. I don't want to be more than one page behind. So we'll do a double page with God's help pretty soon. At any rate, everyone was on the same page. They would announce what tractate is being studied in Judea. The Galileans didn't do that. So, on this question of me'abrin, is it spelled with an alef or with an ayin? What did they do? They went to the Judeans and they said, well, is it spelled with an alef or with an ayin? You're the guys who are very particular about language, and you're the guys that have mnemonics, and you're the guys that everyone's teaching and learning the same thing, and learning on the same schedule, and learning the same page, and you have one central authority. So surely you guys know, what is it, ayin or alef? And you may know the classic Jewish joke of the new rabbi, who gets in, the young new rabbi gets installed in a congregation that's been around for a long time. And at his first service as the new rabbi, he's surprised to see that when the congregation gets to the Shema prayer, half of them are standing and half of them are sitting. And the ones who are standing are saying to the ones who are sitting, hey, stand up, stand up. And the ones who are sitting are saying to the ones that are standing up, yeah, sit down, sit down, sit down. And there's all this mumbling going on when they start the Shema. And this goes on for a few days. There's this disagreement on something that is like, like a basic prayer that they do every morning in morning services and in the evening services. And why is there no agreement? There's no just custom that's established in this old shul, and he can't understand it. So finally, he goes to the synagogue president, and he says, "Well, why is there all this disagreement?" And he says, that's just the kind of people we are, I guess. And he says, well, what did you do when the old rabbi was here? And the president says, well, why don't we just go ask him? What's the way that we should do it? So they go ask the retired rabbi, and they say, so Rabbi, what is correct for this congregation? Should they be sitting for Shema or standing for Shema? And he says, there's been just some disagreement for a long time, and, you should ask the previous rabbi, the Rabbi Emeritus, the great rabbi who's now in the nursing home. They go to the nursing home, and they say, well, half the people here are saying that everyone should be sitting for the Shema, and half the people are saying we should be standing for the Shema. Yeah, and the old rabbi says, yeah. And they're all arguing with each other about which way it should be. And he says, that's the custom that we all argue about it. And likewise, when they went to the Judeans and said, so is me'abrin with an ayin or with an alef? And they said, well, some do it with an alef and some do it with an ayin. And so that just seems to be one of those little disagreements about language, which are going to persist. And even now, there are commentators who are going to side with it should be with ayin, and other commentators who are going to side with the people who say it should be alef. Before we finish this page and get to your comments and questions, we have a story, or three tiny stories, micro stories, about Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya. And one of these, the third of these, is actually one of the most famous little stories in the whole Talmud. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya is the great Rabbi Yehoshua. When we're talking about when it's just somebody brought in as a teaching, giving a ruling as Rabbi Yehoshua, we're talking about Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya. And very important sage. His teachings, appear hundreds and hundreds of times throughout the Talmud. He was definitely one of those earlier sages. He was there. He witnessed the fall of the Second Temple. He was one of the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who sort of saved Torah learning when the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem. And in fact, he and his colleague, his fellow student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, his fellow student was the great Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. The great Eliezer, who we're going to have lots of stories about Rabbi Eliezer as well, but it was Eliezer and Yehoshua who carried Yochanan ben Zakkai, pretending that he's a corpse, that he's dead. They carried his coffin out of Jerusalem, and that's how they saved the head of the sages at that time. And then Yochanan was able to negotiate with the Roman general Vespasian, to be, allowed to pull the sages out of Jerusalem before it was totally ransacked, and to reestablish Torah learning in the little community of Yavne, north of Jerusalem. At any rate, Yehoshua ben Chananya was one of the sages known especially for the sharpness, for his acute mind and the sharpness of his teachings and the way that he wielded words. He was a very, very, very gifted and precise speaker. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya says, I've been blessed that I'm able to learn Torah and recite it and speak with great clarity and great authority. And in fact, in all my days, every time I was in a debate with somebody else, nobody ever bested me. He's not bragging, it's just true. Nobody ever bested him in Torah debates. He says, except 3 times. There were only 3 times that he was bested in argumentation. And those 3 times, the disputants in those 3 instances were a woman, a girl, and a boy. Meaning a woman, a young girl, and a young boy. The woman was an attendant in an inn. And he messed up. He was eating at this inn. He was probably just so busy, reviewing his studies or arguing with somebody that he was eating with. And what did he do? He took all the food that was on the serving plate and ate it. And he did that the first day, and he did that the second day. And on the third day, the woman who brought the serving plate that had, like a pile of beans on it, let's say, she put a lot of salt on it. And when he tasted, he's like, ooh, I can't eat that. And she said, oh, is the master not going to eat his beans? And he's like, yeah, I had a big lunch. I'm not really hungry. And she said, oh, well, you should have had a little less bread at lunch so that you could eat more beans now. And he's like, yeah, I guess you're right. And she said, no, but really what you should have done is for the last 2 days, you should have observed the etiquette of the sages and not finished all the food on the serving plate, shouldn't you? And he's like, yeah, you're absolutely right. And that is an etiquette that we see right here on this page in the Talmud. You don't take the last bite from the communal plate. You don't. And in fact, in Spain, they call that the last bite, they call it the la de vergüenza, as they would say in Spain, meaning the person who takes that last piece of food on the communal plate, he should be embarrassed because it's good manners not to take the very last bite. And now we learn why. Because in ancient times, the people who were serving you, right, the waiters and waitresses in an inn, for example, they made very little money. And they were so busy running people's food around. We wouldn't do this today. But back then, those scraps that were left on the communal plates, they would eat that. That would be part of the food that they could eat during the day so that they wouldn't go hungry. They were paid very little. And it was part of their pay. And so in a sense, probably tipping was not then what it is now, so standardized, 15, 20%. But leaving some of that food on the plate was considered the tip. And Yehoshua ben Chananya had just sort of not thought about it, forgot about it, and she reminded him. The second instance, when he was bested in this kind of verbal encounter, was by a young girl. I'm going to read that to you. What is the incident with the young girl? Says Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, one time I was walking along the path, and the path passed through a field, and I was walking on it. And a certain young girl said to me, my rabbi, isn't this a field? One should not walk through a field so as not to damage the crops growing there. I said to her, isn't it a well-trodden path? I mean, I'm walking on a path. Obviously, it's a path. A lot of people have walked through here before. Isn't it a well-trodden path in the field across which one is permitted to walk? It's an established path, says Rabbi Yehoshua. She said to me, robbers like you have trodden it. In other words, it previously had been prohibited to walk through this field because a farmer owns it. And when you walk through the field so that you have a shortcut, you're killing his crops that grow under what becomes the path. And it is only due to people such as you who paid no attention to the prohibition that a path has been cut across it. And thus the young girl defeated Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya in a debate. And that's a pretty simple takeaway. Just because everybody else does it doesn't make it right. And we should all be hyper alert to, practices in our world, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, even in our homes that have just become commonplace, but that really are taking a toll on somebody. And just because it's just become the regular thing doesn't mean that it's fair to the person whose rights are getting trampled. So, just the fact that everyone's doing it doesn't justify anything. And Rabbi Yehoshua taught that in this little girl's name. And the final incident, right, which, the first time I made my journey through the Talmud, so I started March 2005, right? This year we started in January, now we're in October. So I must have hit this in about December of 2005. And I was actually on a trip to Israel then. Our film, When Do We Eat, was screening in the Jerusalem Film Festival. And I read this, and man, I have been quoting it ever since. So I've been quoting this teaching for 15 years. What is the incident with a young boy? Says Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya. One time I was walking along the path, and I saw a young boy sitting at the crossroads. And I said to him, "On which path shall we walk in order to get to the city?" And he said to me, so it's a crossroads, right? "This path is short and long, and that path is long and short." I walked on the path that was short and long. When I approached the city, I found that gardens and orchards surrounded it, and I did not know the trails leading through them to the city. In other words, he took the short path to the city, much shorter in distance to get to the city. It's either a short path to the city or a long path to the city. But the short path, when you get right up near the city, you get into these orchards and gardens and walls, and you can't get through them. So he ends up coming back to where the boy is. And I went back and I met the young boy again, and I said to him, "My son, didn't you tell me that this way is short?" He said to me, "And didn't I tell you that it was also long?" I kissed him on his head and said to him, "Happy are you, O Israel, for you are all exceedingly wise, from your old to your young." But this idea, right, of the short and long path or the long and short path, right? And there's been obviously many wisdom teachings about this same idea, that when you take the shortcut, you might end up taking twice as long as if you just took the long way around, right? Because the shortcut is a shortcut, but it can lead to all kinds of trouble. So when you want to make that teaching, remember the boy at the crossroads who says it's not a short and a long path. It's one path is short and long, and the other path is long and short. All right, let's see if we've got comments or questions. Looks like just one that I've got right now from Lucy. So the later generations lose ground because they are further away from the Sinai experience. Correct. And when we study Talmud, it is a way to get closer to that experience through the words of those before us. Just so. It's exactly right. When you think about the idea that obviously scientific knowledge advances all the time, there are many observations about the world that are available to us now that were not available to our ancestors. Granted. But there were observations and wisdoms and knowledges and understandings that were available to our ancestors about the way the world really works. Not how does the sun rise in the morning, but why. Why this world exists, why we're here, what our values are, what we're trying to do, what we're trying to transmit to the next generation about how to live a meaningful and righteous life. And it's not like our sages were perfect. We've seen many times they make all kinds of mistakes, not just mistakes, technical mistakes, knowledge mistakes. They make deep moral mistakes. Yesterday we heard the story of Elisha ben Abuya, who went completely off the rails. Nonetheless, they had access to some of that huge infusion of wisdom that entered the world when the Torah was given at Sinai. And they had access to some of the reverberations of that event that are no longer possible for us if we just look out into the world for it. But if we go into the tradition and try to grasp what our ancestors are saying to us, then we enter conversation with them. And that's why the Talmud is the furthest thing from a dead book of old aphorisms. The Talmud is a living, breathing fountain of wisdom. And when we enter and engage and have this kind of learning together, we're having a dialogue, we're having a conversation, we're sitting in the classroom, in the study hall of these great sages. And then we get a little bit of that access that they can provide for us to that wisdom that was available to them through their hearts as big as the entranceway to the great entranceway of the Holy Temple. That's what I've got for us today. I'm wishing you the sweetest good Shabbos and Hag Sameach as we enter the festival of our rejoicing, where Sukkot begins tonight. You know, we went through the high holidays. All of us came before the heavenly court for a decree for the coming year. We examined our deeds. We said, well, you know, this is an area where I can do better this year. The resolve to do better, it's a fragile thing. It can easily go away. We were very pure. We understood where our shortcomings lie when we confess them on Yom Kippur. So if we're resolving to do better in the coming year, that resolve is fragile. And the sukkah is a kind of representation of that fragile new you. But if we pray to God every day for help in affirming who we are and being who we really are, and, you know, remembering who we are, that soul that came into this world to perform a unique mission that no other soul can perform. If we pray for help with that, then this fragile new you will take more and more and more, you know, hard substance that you'll be able to carry forward the rest of the year. It's Shabbos and Hag Sameach.